Late on April 9th, Trump's attitude took a dramatic turn. He announced a 90-day suspension of tariffs on all countries except China and reduced the base tariff to 10%. However, he was extremely tough on China, raising the tariff on Chinese goods to 125%. This move was really puzzling. Why did Trump suddenly back down? To figure this out, we need to go back to April 7th. On April 7th, in the face of China's tough countermeasures, that is, imposing a 34% tariff on US goods as well, Trump was extremely arrogant. He claimed that if China did not cancel the additional tariffs within 24 hours, that is, before April 8th, he would impose an additional 50% tariff on Chinese products. He sounded as if he were standing on top of the world, able to tax whoever he wanted and however much he wanted. As it turned out, in the early morning of April 8th, a particularly thought-provoking thing happened. The official account of the Chinese embassy in the United States suddenly at Trump's social account on Twitter, but didn't send a single word. This was really interesting. This seemingly simple action had a very clear meaning. It was April 8th, and then, what exactly did Trump want to do? We were just waiting to see his next move. Let's analyze this first. Could the act of the Chinese embassy in the United States at Trump's social account be an individual act? Absolutely not. Chinese diplomacy is well known for its discipline. Such a significant act, which could be regarded as a provocation to Trump if it were an individual act, I bet that within a day at most, the entire staff of the Chinese embassy in the United States would be seriously punished, and this tweet would definitely be deleted. But in fact, nothing happened. So, this was undoubtedly an organizational act, a planned and organized action at the national level. Since this was a planned and organized act by China, what was its purpose? At that time, Trump publicly threatened China that it must cancel the additional tariffs before April 8th, otherwise the US would impose an additional 50% tariff on China. By April 8th, China had not canceled the additional tariffs. At this time, Trump faced two options. The first option was to fulfill his promise and impose an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods. We tentatively estimated this possibility to be 80%. After all, Trump had spoken so boldly before. If he didn't do something, he would lose face. The second option was to temporarily refrain from escalating the tariff measures and seek a negotiated solution with China. We tentatively estimated this possibility to be 20%. As everyone knows, Trump has always been tough. It's not his style to take the initiative to seek negotiations. However, the action of the official account of the Chinese embassy in the US, which carried a strong sense of provocation and coercion, directly cornered Trump and forced him to take the first option. In a sense, this almost eliminated Trump's second option. Therefore, Trump's subsequent retaliatory move of imposing a 50% tariff on China was, to a certain extent, the result of China's deliberate coercion. Some people may ask, why did China do this? Isn't it asking for trouble? Letting Trump raise the tariff on China from 54% to 104%, what benefit is there for us? But dear friends, if we look at April 10th, just 2 days later, we will find that this move by China was really far-sighted and full of wisdom. First of all, for China internally, Trump's 100% tariff was like a powerful medicine, quickly helping China to reach a consensus. When the US raised the tariff on China to 54%, there was actually a very strong voice in our country hoping that the government would negotiate with the US and make some compromises. Their reason was that if we lost the US market, thousands of factories might close down and millions of people might lose their jobs. If we negotiated with the US could reduce the tariff a little, our RMB could depreciate a little, and we could find ways to reduce costs internally. Even with a 54% tariff, we could barely manage. Some people even said that we could sell TikTok to the US and also sell Li Ka-shing's ports to the US. But when the US raised the tariff to 104%, almost all the people I know who are engaged in North American foreign trade were angry and amused. Such a high tariff was simply unworkable. It completely cut off everyone's livelihood. At this time, there was only one voice left in the country. The US was bullying people too much, and we could only fight to the end with the US. Trump's 100% tariff was like a catalyst, unifying the consensus among the 1.4 billion people in China. This was the first clever point of China's move. The second key light was to prompt a transformation in the EU's attitude. Before April 8th, the EU had been maintaining close communication with Beijing. At that time, the main stance of the EU in our communication was to persuade. They hoped that we would remain calm and avoid a sharp confrontation with Trump. The EU's thinking was straightforward. They intended to satisfy some of Trump's demands as much as possible to bring the global economic and trade system back on its original track. This was because they were aware that if there was a severe head-to-head confrontation between China and the US, the global economic and trade system would have to be reshaped. And once the global economic and trade system was rebuilt from scratch, all countries would bear a huge cost, and no one could stay out of it. We couldn't afford to ignore the EU's opinion, especially when Trump was being so aggressive. However, on April 8, when Trump wildly imposed an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods once again, we were also forced to go all the way and imposed an additional 50% tariff on US goods in return. At this point, the sharp confrontation between China and the US became irreconcilable. More importantly, China's attitude in response to the US won widespread acclaim from the whole world. On overseas social media platforms, even those netizens who used to be anti-China were giving China likes one after another. This exerted significant public opinion pressure on the EU. China's unyielding attitude was there for all to see, while Trump was humiliating the representatives of various countries who went to negotiate with him in various ways. This cornered the EU, and they had no choice but to follow China to a certain extent and show a tough stance. Just a few hours after China announced that it would increase the tariff on US goods to 84, the EU voted internally and decided to impose a 25% tariff on US goods. Now it was Trump's turn to make a move. Trump was already under immense pressure for initiating a tariff war against the whole world. Let's put aside the continuous wave of protests within the US and the serious divisions within Trump's team. Take Elon Musk, for example. His dissatisfaction was growing stronger and stronger, which was a very clear signal. Let's focus on the two areas that Trump cared about the most. One was the continuous sharp decline in the capital market. Just think about it. Trump had always regarded the stock market as an important symbol of his political achievements. When the stock market dropped, he was under great pressure from capital magnates from all quarters. The other was the abnormal rise in the yield of US Treasury bonds in recent days. What does this indicate? It indicates that investors were selling US Treasury bonds on a large scale. The US has $6.5 trillion worth of Treasury bonds maturing in June, and it will have to issue new bonds to pay off the old ones at that time. With the continuous rise in the yield of US Treasury bonds now, the US government's financing costs have increased significantly. This is really a serious situation. Most crucially, the EU also began to take tough measures and announced a 25% tariff on US goods. Trump had to respond to this. If he continued to maintain a tough stance, he would have to impose additional tariffs on EU goods. But if Trump really did that, it was highly likely to force the EU to escalate its countermeasures. China was a typical example of this. An escalation of the confrontation would only silence the compromising faction within the EU and prompt the EU to adopt more intense means of resistance. If it really pushed the EU and China to unite, it would be a big problem. In the future, there would surely be more countries siding with China and the EU. Then, there would truly be a situation where the US was facing the whole world alone. No matter how crazy Trump was, he had to consider the consequences of such a situation. By the night of April 9th, it was highly probable that Trump realized he had been outmaneuvered by China. In a moment of impulse, he had fallen into China's trap. So, after weighing the pros and cons, he backed down instantly. You know, being blustery on the outside but timid on the inside was Trump's true nature. He announced that tariffs on all countries except China would be suspended for 90 days, and the base tariff would be reduced to 10%. That is to say, in the face of the EU's toughness, Trump surprisingly chose to compromise. However, this was nothing to be afraid of for China. The logic was simple. If high tariffs were only imposed on China while all other countries were exempted, it would mean that in the future, there would be countless countries serving as springboards for entrepot trade, like washing crabs, repackaging goods to make them seem as if they are from another source. Chinese goods might enter the US market through other countries after some repackaging. Trump's tariff policy might then become nothing more than an empty promise. Moreover, don't forget that Trump was the kind of person who could change his policies 3 times in a single day. It was hard not to suspect that he was constantly manipulating the stock market, engaging in wild short selling and buying, trying to reap the last huge profit before the collapse of his empire. There was really a big question mark over whether his tariff policies were for the benefit of the United States or for his own personal gain.